Today I will talk to you a little bit briefly about the method we followed, and then I will talk you through each of the scenarios we developed. For us, scenarios were a means of exploring issues raised by these new technologies with stakeholders, primarily domain experts, but also policymakers and technologists. And on the back of this, to develop recommendations for dealing with the issues raised, especially recommendations that address the needs of policymakers. The overall scenario process can be split down in 3 key stages: a very important kickoff workshop. And the workshop comprised domain experts, technologists, and policymakers, and the idea was to derive an initial scenario. Following that, the initial scenario, once it was verified and by the participants of the workshop, the second round was to open it up to our stakeholder board that apart ethicists and human rights experts primarily, in order to get their input and also to check the scenario for completeness. Having integrated their opinions and views, we then open it up to a wider public engagement round to identify issues and recommendations that might have been missed previously, and also to collect views from the wider society. Okay. Sorry, we had a mini technical problem. That's why the interruption. Sorry about that. Okay. Let me talk you a little bit through the structure of the workshop, because it's also the same structure that we follow for the written scenario. Each kickoff workshop comprised from 7 to 20 domain participants, as I said before, and was structured, it lasted about half a day. The agenda of the workshop and the logic of the written scenario subsequently was as follows. We started with the expected technological progress to set the scene about what is plausible technologically in the horizon and the time frame we set. In our case, it was a horizon until 2025. Then we developed a vignette, the scenario storyline, if you like, that presents the way technology will be used by 2025, our assumptions, the anticipated societal conditions, etc. As part of that, we discussed the drivers and barriers, what is the social, economic, financial, political, regulatory, technological, and other forces that drive or hinder either the development or the utilization of such technologies in society. What are the relevance of these factors? How likely are they going to be? And what is the strength, if you like, their tenacity in affecting the use and development of these technologies in the foreseeable future? Following that, we focused on the impact, the impact of these technologies in terms of their ethical aspects, legal aspects, societal, economic. And we try to understand what is the nature of the impact, and also to what extent there is participants' agreement about such impacts. Once we have these core elements and a common understanding about the background, the groundwork of these scenarios, we then turn to discussing solutions. And solutions, when we talked about solutions, we talked about mitigating efforts, that what can we do to mitigate the negative impacts and to attenuate the positive impacts of such technologies by 2025? What steps can policymakers take today? And this is what we call backcasting, to reach these desired futures and avoid the undesirable ones. And how can we blend these two things into recommendations so that policymakers can progress? during policy making. And this was basically the structure of how we wrote the scenarios. So there is a correspondence between what we discussed in the workshop and what is written on paper when we open it to the stakeholder board and we open it to wider public consultation. Now I would like to talk to you through the 5 scenarios. So our 5 scenarios focus on 3 civic domains: social care, education and transport, and 2 public service domains: policing and warfare. I will talk you through each of the scenarios, but while I'm doing this, please have 2 questions in mind. What other important issues we might have missed because we're still looking for your opinions? And what do you see as the best approach to tackle such issues? So let me start with our first scenario. We call these scenarios technologies that mimic people. Mimicking technologies in these particular scenarios focus on social care. It discussed anthropomorphic technologies that seek to imitate and therefore substitute in some way social carers in one or more of their tasks. These technologies can be disembodied, such as virtual assistants like, the Amazon's Alexa, or embodied ones, for example, in the form of companion robots. The key drivers for the introduction of such technologies in Europe in particular is the aging population and the expected shortage of trained staff. We envisioned a world where senior citizens will be looked after by personalized social robots that take on the personality of a loved one. In this case, Alfred, our key figure in the scenario, Alfred's deceased spouse, his wife. The idea to personalize a robot after his wife was to keep him company, but also to ensure adherence to medical regimes that were necessary for his well-being, to watch over him and, to ensure nothing bad will happen, and also to keep him company. We envisaged that such social robots will be owned by social services and deployed to citizens based on certain social services criteria. There are a plethora of issues and key ethical questions that arise from the deployment of such technologies. For example, is it moral to create a potential psychological attachment to such machines? Can these machines manipulate citizens into behaviors that restrict their autonomy or their free will? Is it even ethical to technically reincarnate a dead person? And what would that mean for family dynamics? Could this technology be an inroad by companies and even the state to introduce 24/7 surveillance of senior citizens, and not only them, but also their interactions with their visitors? And how about covert data gathering and invisible processing of such personal data? So these were the key areas and focus of concerns from participants around the deployment of such technologies, of AI technologies in social care. Our next domain was the deployment in education. In the form of virtual learning buddies. The key drivers, again, is the shortage of trained staff for one-to-one tuition to personalize learning experiences based on a child's learning and studying habits. The assumption is that learning buddies will be owned and deployed by schools to children facing difficulties and in order to raise their performance. There are, of course, questions about the extent that such technologies deprive children from human contact and socialization. The more we interact with machines, the less we interact with each other. There are also issues about potential discrimination. For example, are we all going to have equal access to these technologies? Or will we create a tiered educational caste where such technologies are more available to the more affluent people? More importantly, there are questions about accountability of a child's learning, and moral questions about the children's freedom of thought and right to self-discovery, which is fundamental for one's psychological development. But I believe the discussion around these technologies open up more fundamental questions about pedagogy beyond the technologies per se. They are pushing us to look at pedagogy in a more fundamental way. So these were some of the key questions discussed around the deployment of AI in education. Our next civic application was the development of autonomous cars. There's a lot of discussion at the moment, and governments are pushing for self-driving vehicles in general, in combination with pay-as-you-go schemes. Some of the key drivers for the introduction of these technologies is the decrease in traffic, decreasing the number of cars on the streets, reducing accidents, and personalizing public transport to cater for a variety of user needs. Fundamental ethical questions concern the physical safety of the passengers and also other people on the streets, accountability, particularly in the cases of unavoidable accidents. And what about privacy and surveillance of movement of the passengers? As well, what is the potential threat of cybersecurity? For example, what if somebody hacks into these autonomous cars to cause a terrorist attack or to kill the passengers of the vehicle? These were some of the key fundamental questions that are areas of concerns rather than, the detailing of it that I'm presenting here. And you can see more of this and in more detail in our written scenarios on the website. Now I would like to move away from civic applications to public service applications of these technologies. And let me start with one of the controversial uses of such technologies in predictive policing. The idea of preventing crime is one of the key goals of police forces. Technologies can help us surveil populations, but also develop models to predict crime in order to concentrate our efforts and increasingly scarce police resources to prevent crime. That's the idea and the key driver behind the introduction of AI in policing. There are, of course, human rights issues around mass surveillance, civil rights infringements, as well as issues of public consent, because such technologies will be introduced en masse rather than selectively. There are also issues around the bias and discrimination, especially when it comes to developing models for predicting crime. Who is surveilled and what criteria are used for deciding this? But also in the areas of civil life, such technologies, but also at which areas of civil life these technologies will be deployed. For example, will they be deployed to prevent civil unrest and petty crime, or will they be used to avoid corporate crime and fraud? These are decisions. These are societal decisions about their deployment. The next area of application, and perhaps the most controversial of them all, is the deployment of AI in warfare. There are many deliberations at the moment in NATO and internationally about the use of, for example, killer robots or autonomous weapons. And while this concerns somewhat of a more distant future because the technology is not there to cater for them until 2025, maybe there are more immediate applications of AI and big data in warfare. For example, the use of AI to launch cyber attacks in critical infrastructures or instigate civil arrests by spreading inflammatory fake news in social media. Such use of these technologies is reminiscent a little bit of a Cold War era that blur the lines of responsibility. For example, it is unclear in such attacks who is behind them and how much each party involved is to be blamed. And this is fundamental, especially when it comes to determining a proportionate response, and more importantly, to do so in a timely fashion in order to de-escalate such a situation. Moreover, the introduction of AI in cyber warfare means an overall increase in defense budgets, whether in defense budgets overall and irrespective of who is deploying these technologies. And this is at the expense of utilizing taxes in other aspects of civil life. And this was a brief presentation of the 5 different domains we developed scenarios for. You can, of course, see the full versions of our scenarios and give us feedback if you like at our webpage. This is, and I will show you the link for that. And we would most than welcome your feedback and questions. Thank you very much for listening.